physics. And I think this is ultimately one of the most important areas to carefully reproduce. Most of what some of us have done is to work to carefully reproduce some of Reich's physics experiments. Because I think ultimately one of the problems with the acceptance of ergonomy is to have carefully done experiments that can be taken seriously by other scientists. One of the things about Reich's approach, which was very productive, was that it was highly qualitative. Reich was very interested in how things functioned. He was very interested in the feeling of things, and much less interested in making measurements the way they're normally done in classical physics. He wanted to understand how something functioned, and not to build up a great big database of measurements. That was very productive for him, but a lot of things are left a little subjective. And so what we would like to do is, and what we have been doing, is reproduce Reich's work with Bions, the accumulator, T O minus T, the electroscope, and so forth, so that there is rigid protocols for demonstrating that these things work. Because ultimately, you can't really expect people to take it seriously unless you have something very specific and reproducible to present to them. Now, this is a source of difficulty. There has not been, since Reich's death, very much really good work done at the scientific level in ergonomy. And I think what you end up with is several different kinds of people that don't mix very well. You have a group of people that are open to new ideas, but not scientifically sophisticated. So they don't have enough training to go ahead and do the work at the level that it needs to be done. It's too frightening, it's too different, so it doesn't get done. So this group of people is it's hard to communicate with the scientific establishment. So who's going to do the work? A very few people who are well trained, but I think that's very important to emphasize that a high degree of training is necessary to advance ergonomy. There are many people who are interested in it in a casual way, but we need people who are scientifically sophisticated, who can stay with the work and advance it in a technical way. Mostly you make an accumulator, a small accumulator that's very strong, about so big, because otherwise it gets too complicated to control the experiment. You have to do it very carefully. That's one thing that one can't emphasize too much. Reich discovered a number of things without controlling them in a very careful way, which is necessary to understand what you've really got and what you don't have. And TO minus T has been done and carefully controlled. It's been published, but more people need to do it just to satisfy themselves that it can be done. I have the feeling that in some cases the reluctance is that they know it works or it might work, and if it did work, it would be such a profound, TO minus T is a very profound experiment. It overthrows the whole second law of thermodynamics. So I think that they're anxious about the fact that it might work, and then where would that leave them? The same kind of thing can be said in biology. For example, with bions. If you can demonstrate the bions, that opens up an entirely new way of looking at biology, and people just are afraid to see it. I had an occasion one time to, when I was in my medical training, to look at some blood from a child that had leukemia with a hematologist. And there were bions forming in the cells under the microscope, and I pointed them out to her, and she made an excuse that it was a dirty slide and threw it away. And then we repeated the experiment, and the bions reappeared again. and she did the same thing. It was right in front of her, but it wasn't part of her training. She didn't know what she was seeing, so therefore it was an artifact, and she threw it away. And I'm sure this happens a great deal. As a matter of fact, he took me to meet Reich the first time that he went, when I was 2 years old. And then many years later, I spent some time up at Organon with Reich, and so I was in the ergonomic area ever since I was 2 years old. Orgone energy was the first energy that I ever heard about. It was the first energy. The word energy to me means orgone. It's the first one that I ever heard. So my interest was always to study orgone energy, and in particular the physics of it. After Reich's death, the group that he had did not really continue his work in any kind of organized fashion. TO-T, the electroscope, which Reich talks about in the cancer biopathy, and making atmospheric observations to demonstrate the door and the aura in the atmosphere, which is an increasing problem. So our institute has continued research. We publish our annals, our journal. We train individuals. We give them lab courses to show them, to demonstrate and train in the scientific work, including biology, and in particular refining the right blood test, which we've given to a number of people and use it for diagnostic purposes in a research way. An undergraduate degree in physics. I did a year of graduate work in physics, and then I went to medical school and got my MD degree, and now I'm a practicing therapist. But in my spare time, my scientific interest is in the physics. Orgonomy as a science is a difficult area to work in. It's very different from other areas of science because so little is known really, except general and broad principles. And because of the nature of the orgone energy itself, the experiments you do are often highly unpredictable. I mean, Reich had the experience of making accumulators, and some of them didn't work, and nobody knew why. We have that experience today. For example, Reich describes carefully how he did TO-T, where he gets a positive temperature difference in the accumulator. Since that time, I have built a number of accumulators and done TO-T, and we find in many cases TO-T is regularly negative, which Reich does not talk about in much. I think he knew about it, but I don't know that he published much about it. That's the kind of new thing that shows up that's hard to understand what it means. It opens up a whole new area. The way the orgone energy functions is obviously a whole lot more sophisticated than we realize. So you have to be ready when you're doing this research to be ready for the unexpected, for an experiment not to work, to do it exactly the same way you did it last week. And for this reason, the unexpected, the way you take care of that is to make careful notes. And a lot of people don't have the scientific discipline to write down everything that happens. I've had the occasion many times of doing a very simple experiment and getting a very clear result. It's very obvious, you know what's happening, but you write it down. You do the same experiment a week later, it turns out differently, and you don't know why, and you don't even believe it, and you have to go back to your notes and look and say, oh yes, this is what I wrote down, and it's different, and the conditions are the same. I think that kind of unpredictability is very difficult for many people. It's emotionally stressful because you don't know what you're doing differently, and it's hard to get reproducible results. We did, for example, we wanted to study and demonstrate the biological activity of the accumulator and the medical doorbuster. So this is our institute. We got an animal model which was a strain of mice that we could wound and then treat the wounds. We ran the experiment for 7 years, and altogether we used about 1,200 mice. It took several years of refining the experiment until we could get reproducible results, so that almost every time we did it, we would get a positive increase in the rate of wound healing. Along the way, we found out a lot of variation that was normally taking place, not only in normal wound healing, but in the action of the devices themselves. The devices themselves vary during different seasons, during different times of the day, under different weather conditions, and all of this has to be taken into account. You just can't take an accumulator and do an experiment, because the history of that accumulator is important, the weather is important, the season is important, in terms of how the accumulator is going to behave, whether it's going to be active or toxic. So you have to write everything down and reproduce it as carefully as you can. Also, in this kind of work, one's personal sensitivity is very important. And how do you know an accumulator is working? You can stick a thermometer in and do a very careful measurement. Or if you're sensitive, you can put your hand in, but not everybody is sensitive enough to feel that it's working. So if you give the experiment to somebody who's not sensitive, they don't think there's anything going on. They think it's just an empty box. So it's hard to get someone from the scientific establishment to take it seriously. That's one reason. That's one of the problems. I mean, there are many other problems too. But one of the problems is that you have to be sensitive to this to work in it, and a lot of people aren't sensitive. One isn't normally trained even to pay attention to that kind of thing. I think the main interest in orgonomy has always been historically the therapy. Most people come for therapy. Most people are interested in reading the books for what it can do for their personal life, what they can learn to make their life better, to live a better life. And therapy is part of that. People secondarily get interested in the scientific aspects, sometimes for the same reason, so that they can learn enough about clean atmosphere so they can live better. And a very small percentage of people come to either become researchers, doctors, or otherwise study the organ energy. But
ist es denn so, dass Sie Therapie gut abgeschlossen haben und sagen, okay, jetzt geht es mir besser, oder verändert sich was für Ihr Leben?
Well, someone who has had a great deal of therapy or finished therapy, their attitudes may change. They often become dissatisfied with the kind of work that they were doing before. Most people want more interesting work, more challenging work. I find that during the course of therapy, a large percentage of patients will either go back for more education, or change jobs, or get some kind of increased level of interest or level of responsibility in their jobs. They want a more interesting life. They want more interesting work. They're not satisfied doing the same kinds of things. They also become much more choosy about their mates and the people that they date because of some personal pain that they were in. And when they get that taken care of, they may have no interest in orgonomy itself. Their problem was taken care of, and they may go on with their lives. Occasionally someone will come into therapy and become interested in the process of therapy and how it works and what it's all about, and start reading Reich and get interested in. But usually not. I would say that's a minority of patients. Most people just come because they're feeling bad and they want some relief. And they don't have to understand how it works in order to get that relief.
Wenn man heute direkt etwas lernen will von Orgonomie oder in der Disziplin von Orgonomie, welche Möglichkeiten gibt es innerhalb von Amerika und außerhalb von Amerika?
It would depend on the level that you wanted to be trained. If you want to practice as a therapist, what we require is that you get your MD degree, and then go on for specialized training in psychiatry and become board certified. At that time, during your training, during your residency training, we have a training program It's not the only one, but we have a training program where we introduce Reich's work at a didactic level. They have to also have their own personal therapy, study the scientific materials in a laboratory course, participate in a seminar, take examinations, and so forth. So they have to have a personal restructuring as well as education in Reich's scientific and medical work. Now, if someone wanted to just do research, we give laboratory courses for people that have a scientific background and then want to know what the specifics are of Reich's scientific work. And then they sort of have to take it from there. Yes, we do, as part of our advanced lab course, give training in how to do the blood test. It's more or less an introduction. To actually do the blood test carefully takes quite a few hours at the microscope to get a qualitative feel for what's happening and then to be able to interpret the data. But we can train people to do that. We have trained people to do that, and then they can go out and do the blood test. But it's not, I can't say that it's in widespread use. There's only a few people doing it. To become a medical ergonomist, you have to have gone a certain distance in your therapy. To do research, no, you don't have to have therapy, but it helps. Because one's feelings are so important, and particularly one's anxiety about the work or irrational reactions, one has to at least know what one has a tendency to do, where one's sources of anxiety are, so that they don't get in the way. But it's not absolutely necessary. One could study the work and learn about it and do research, but therapy would certainly be a great asset. It would be very helpful. Be discouraging about doing research, I would say read Reich thoroughly, start off with some basic experiments to get a feeling for it. I think one has to go slowly and carefully. If you want to do research in ergonomy, start off satisfying yourself in some of the basic experiments. Do it yourself. It's the only way to get a feeling for it. Reading the books is not enough. And then take it from there. So much to do that a little concentrated effort is very rewarding. There's a lot of very exciting things that show up.
So, dass eigentlich viele Genreich interessiert sind, sehr schnell in oberflächlichen Disziplinen, um es mal so zu nennen, gefangen bleiben. So, also die Sachen breiten sich schneller aus. Wenn Ergonomie eigentlich nur in Amerika vertreten ist und im Wesentlichen jetzt hier an der Ostküste und das eigentlich sehr, sehr schwierig ist, Kontakt zu bekommen.
Yeah.
Also von europäischer Seite, was kann da getan werden, um das zu verbessern?
That's a very difficult thing. I think it might be very helpful for people who are interested in research to form a group so that they can support each other and keep clear about what principles and what concepts that they're working with. So that if someone starts to stray off into some other area that's not relevant, the other members could say, hey, listen, this is interesting but irrelevant. Let's come back. So that if you can put together your collective expertise and your collective motivation, you can sort of keep each other from wandering off like that. It's very easy to get interested in all these peripheral things. That happens in our groups too. People get interested. But the other members will say, okay, that's very interesting, but this is what we're doing. This is the basic ideas that we're working with, and keep them focused. Because all by yourself, there are all kinds of interesting things that might be interesting to pursue. So I would say forming a group with maybe even the expressed motivation that this is what we're going to study. This is the area we're going to pursue.
Das ist die Orientierungslosigkeit. Also da wird eine Sache der anderen gleichgestellt. Also wenn man über Therapie redet, dann Organtherapie ist gut, aber dann gibt es dann noch Vegetotherapie, das ist dasselbe. Und Bioenergetik ist eigentlich auch dasselbe. Und da ist es schwierig zu sagen, hey, kommt zurück.
So, one of the things that might be helpful, and one of the things that is very important in the Institute, our Institute, is an emphasis on work. That people don't simply sit around and talk about ideas, but they have some productive work that they can bring.
Yes.
If they're interested in a particular area, that's okay, as long as they can show that they're doing some experiments in it, some controlled way of exploring it, some scientific way of understanding it. That keeps people grounded in the reality of the orgone energy and what works and what doesn't work, because it's very easy to sit around and have a lot of ideas. It's also very important for the cohesiveness and the strength of a group that it be based on work, so that that has been a problem in groups that I have worked in. The work function is very important. You often get several people who are doing most of the work, organizational work as well as research work, and a lot of people who aren't. And there gets to be resentment between the two different groups, and sometimes power struggles. And what we try to do is make it clear that the power, the people that make decisions, is vested in the people that are doing the work. The people who are actually producing not only research and training, but also making organizational decisions. People who are making the organization work, that the decision-making is put in those people's hands because they're producing. And the other people can be part of the group, but they don't have the power to make decisions, because you have to prove that you're working, you're producing, that you are making contact with the work. You're not just talking about it, but you're willing to put out and produce. I think that's very important, and I think that was very important. Reich realized that was very important when he talked about work democracy. That you have to put power in the hands of the people that are really doing it, that know their subject, so that it doesn't deteriorate into power struggles, people telling each other what to do, but people can say, I know this area because I've done it. That gives me an authority. I have studied this area, this is the work I've done, and this is why I have the right to say something about this area. Now, unfortunately, it's very difficult to find enough people that are willing to and able to work consistently. That's the kind of thing that people need, is some direction from somebody who's done a lot of work and who knows the kinds of things that are going to be difficult, the kinds of areas that are doable, the kinds of emotional problems people get into in groups. Yes, that could be very helpful. To get them started, to get them, you give them a sense of what they need to do. They might even not know where to start as to how to organize some kind of research group or study group. They might not even have a good focus. Yeah, so just when you get people started doing something, it does not have to be necessarily a high level of sophisticated research. You just have to do something where you get a feeling for what it's all about. Like building an accumulator, sitting in it, and seeing what it feels like, so you build up your sensitivity. My emphasis is on having contact with it rather than just intellectual, just talking about it.
Ich glaube, die Amerikaner wissen nicht, was für Probleme in Europa sind in Bezug auf Reich.
In orgonomy. You can talk about the accumulator, but unless you've built one and worked with it, it really doesn't mean anything to you. So you have someone coming in who's interested in acid rain. If orgonomy is going to mean anything to him, he has to have some idea about ore and Dor in the atmosphere, and some idea of the energetics of the atmosphere, which means going out and looking at the atmosphere, and with someone who is sensitive enough to point out, this is Dor, this is ore, this is what we recognize in the atmosphere.
Hat einen berühmten Vater gehabt. So, das würde mich eigentlich auch interessieren nach Reis Tod. Wie ist das gewesen für die
I think, first of all, probably the group that Reich had, and probably that was true of some of his groups earlier, the cohesiveness of the group was, to a large extent, Reich himself. His personality was strong enough and dynamic enough that it kept everybody together. That he could, he was obviously the person in charge. He was the one doing all the creative work. And that was the force which kept everybody together. There was no question about Reich's authority, Reich's knowledge. So there wasn't any argument about who was in charge. When Reich died, that cohesive force was lost. I think there probably was an element of fear about what could be done because the government had given an injunction against the use of accumulator, at least the transport across state lines. So there was probably some fear about that. And probably it means that the group itself didn't have a solid enough basis to stay together. They were sort of drawn in by Reich, and Reich got them interested in doing, at least reproducing some of his scientific work. But mostly they were therapists. They were not primarily there to do research. What research was being done was mostly being done by Reich or being directed by Reich. And when he was gone, I think they went back to their private practices, which was their primary interest to begin with. And maybe some of them did a little bit of research on their own, but there was no really good work function to keep them together. Their work function was doing therapy, and that you do alone. They did not have, I don't think, any other cohesive work reason to be together. So the original group sort of dissipated. Then a younger group of doctors came along that my father trained, and in the early 60s they formed a research laboratory. Besides them being therapists, they also had an interest in doing research. So here was a common interest, a common work function which kept people together. Because a number of people did research, other people were interested in hearing about the research, so they would meet at regular intervals, discuss the work, criticize it, raise money to do more work, and aside from doing therapy. Now, at the same time, there were seminars and training were continuing in the therapy. So here was two reasons for this group of people, who was largely the same group of people, to stay together, to work together. They did have a common research interest, and they had a common interest in therapy. This was in the early 60s. Then, as the group got stronger and larger, eventually it came to forming a formal organization and a formal training program, which has persisted to this day. So these people, I think, they came together not just because there was a powerful personality like Reich. I think they came because they were interested in ergonomy, and here there were some people like my father and Dr. Duval who had worked with Reich. This was a place they could go and learn about it. And so they brought with it probably maybe a little bit more interest, a little bit more sustainable interest in ergonomy than some of the people before. I mean, that seems to be what it all indicates. Not that these other people, the Reich's original group, didn't stay as therapists, although some of them went off and left ergonomy and went off and did other things, but I don't know of any of them that did any kind of significant research. Maybe one or two continued with a blood test. But I say, primarily they were sort of brought together by the force of Reich's personality and the excitement of what Reich was doing. And if that's your reason for being there, when the leader is gone, then the cohesiveness is gone. So I think the younger group came in with more of their own interest, more sustainable interest in the work, and that has kept them together. But you have to be doing something that is meaningful. Today, I would say There are several groups now in this country, and altogether, I would have to estimate there might be 30 or 40 ergonomists. There are other people who are not ergonomists who are also interested, educators that are interested in the work. Like I say, teachers who are interested in the work and are part of the group. But most people are therapists. That's the one thing that people can do on a regular basis and have seminars and talk about. That is one thing that they all have absolutely in common. Much fewer people are interested in doing research, even the doctors. Most doctors are interested in doing the therapy and improving themselves as therapists, but have much less interest in research aspects.
Könnte man der Onkel sagen, wenn man dies oder jenes machen will, ist es besser dahin zu gehen oder das andere Institut hat sich darauf spezialisiert? Wie ist das von der Arbeit?
I would say that our institute, that our philosophy has been to put a great deal more emphasis on work and research. And I think the other institute has more emphasis on education, publication, seminars, and disseminating information to the public. We don't do as much of that. They do somewhat more of that than we do, but I think our research and our work function is a stronger emphasis. I think that if you want to characterize the two groups, that would be one way to do it. Well, here's Reich's work. Let's tell the world about it. Let's have all the seminars and publications and meetings that we can, and let as many people know about it as possible. So that's one way to go about it. You can argue the pros and cons of that. The other way is to say, okay, we'll publish information, have seminars, but the emphasis is on producing reproducible research, understanding how it functions, because in the long run, that's the thing that's going to count. You can talk and talk and talk, but in the long run, whether it works or not is what the scientific establishment is ultimately going to pay attention to. Do you know what you're talking about? Do you have a blood test that is accurate in predicting things? Do you have an accumulating device that is predictable in what it's going to do to a biological organism? And you have to do research before you can establish those things. Yes. Oh, yes. I mean, it's important that people know what we're doing. It's important that we publish information so that people who want to can go on and try to do it themselves. But I think the main idea is to have something solid. And to emphasize the idea that everything that Reich discovered didn't stop when Reich died. That things that Reich wrote are not set for all time, that we can learn more about what Reich discovered and improve upon it, discover new variations, understand it in greater depth. In some people, there's a tendency to take what Reich said as the gospel. This is what Reich said, and to be extremely conservative about accepting any kind of new information about orgonomy. And I think Reich would have been the first one to object to that. I mean, Reich was always moving ahead. Reich was always changing his ideas about how things worked. And you can't just sit and say, well, here's Reich's work, we've got to stay with this and get this disseminated before we think about doing new things. I think the nature of it is that you have to constantly be updating what you understand about the ergo energy. That's also true because the atmosphere is changing. The blood test that Reich did in this country behaves differently now than it did 15 or 20 years ago. And we think it's largely because the atmosphere has changed. So what we had to do in the Institute is develop a modified form of the blood test because it takes longer than it did in Reich's time. So you have to keep changing your understanding of what's going on as the atmosphere changes and as your understanding of ergo energy changes. And I think it's a mistake to take Reich's work as a gospel, which some people do, and say, well, this is where we're going to stand, this is the truth, and to be very, very cautious about introducing new ideas. For example, Reich talked in a very unique way in character analysis about his understanding of the schizophrenic. Now, what we have introduced in our institute was the idea, which we have published, of the ocular character. We've expanded this whole thing. Instead of just taking a certain label, we have expanded the understanding of this particular kind of thing. And I think that's what research is all about. You have to move ahead. You can't just stand on what Reich said.
Reichs Aussagen auch wie ein Gesetz nehmen, wo gesagt wird, das muss so gemacht werden und die Leute müssen erstmal geprüft werden und viele Schwierigkeiten entworfen werden. Was er dazu meint, wie man sich eigentlich vor solchen Sachen schützen kann, auch. Also in der Arbeit selber.
There are certain basic things of Reich that you have to accept and hold on to, or you're not really a follower of Reich. Reich himself thought his two most important discoveries were the orgasm reflex and the physical reality of the organ energy. I think those are probably the two core things that you must not give up. One is the importance of sexuality and the orgasm as an energy regulator, as the basic energy regulator of the organism, and the physical, demonstrable reality of the organ energy. If you hold on to those two things, I think you'll be in pretty good shape. I think then you can explore different scientific and medical areas. But those are the two core things that you must really believe to be a true follower of Reich. And you'll see some other groups, some associated groups that have originally had some interest in Reich, but are not really basic Reichian groups, who do not necessarily believe in the physical reality of organ energy, or they've given up the primary importance of sexuality. So I think those are the two things. If you hold on to those two things, and you understand them and believe them, I don't think you can get in too much trouble. I think it's a mistake on the other side of the coin to simply take everything that Reich said at face value. That's why we reproduced these experiments. Some of them turn out to be more complicated than Reich's understanding, which is fine. And I think people should be free to do that. There can get to be a hierarchy of people that have done more and had more therapy, so they're better. That's true. I think if you have a basically open and decent attitude and you believe in a few fundamental things, that's a lot. If you have people that are decent and open to new ideas and open to criticism, and are willing to look at new ideas, and they believe a few basic things, that's enough. I mean, that's quite a lot. Because you find people who know a great deal and have had a lot of therapy, and they're not so open. So if I had my choice, I'd rather have someone that was decent and open, and a little naive, but still somebody you could talk to, somebody you could trust. The only thing I would add to that is that one has to have a certain minimal amount of knowledge and caution before you work with something like the accumulator. And you have to know what it's about. You respect it as a powerful device, and you should probably talk to somebody who's had some experience with it so you know what you're getting into, because having one of these boxes around can be very toxic. I mean, what I'm saying is it goes without saying that you have to have some common sense and some understanding of what you're working with. It's not a toy. It can be toxic. You have to know what they're dealing with and take it seriously. part of the problem is that if you're not sensitive to it, you don't take it seriously as a powerful device. And it is. It is a powerful device. And you have to know a few basic things about keeping it away from X-ray machines and television sets and so forth. Sometimes I think that's the reason people are very cautious about the use of the accumulator, that people will not be careful with it or abuse it and get sick from it. I mean, it's like anything else.
Yeah.
Everything has a certain amount of risk. I mean, you're talking about a very unlikely kind of event. So sure, I mean, everything has a risk. I think the important thing is to look at what the important risks, the realistic risks are. The realistic risks are that an accumulator can get toxic, sitting in it too long, those kinds of things. That can really happen. And people can get sick from it.
Leute, die arbeiten in der Augenlinie, die sich bemühen, auch gut zu arbeiten, haben folgendes Problem. Sie sagen, dieser Doktor ist Number One. Nur er hat verstanden, andere nicht.
Can we take a break?
Yeah.
While I think about my answer?
Yeah.